Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, JavaScript for the most important language in your stack. My name is Danielle Wombold, and I'll be your moderator. I work on the marketing team here at NPM, and I'm excited to be hosting today's session. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Laurie Voss. Laurie is one of our co-founders and chief data officer here at NPM. Laurie has been the driving force behind the survey to further understand the amazing things developers are building. Before I hand it over to Laurie, I have a few housekeeping items to cover about the presentation in the BrightTalk webinar platform. First, today's webinar will be available on demand after the live session, and it is accessible through the same link you're using now. We've also added some attachments, which are available through the attachment tabs at the bottom of your screen. There you will find today's deck, a link to the full survey results, and other related content including a blog post and upcoming webinar. Next, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have a question for Laurie, please feel free to send it through the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of your player. We will be answering questions at the end of the session. If we don't get to your question during today's webinar, we will be sure to follow up with you afterwards. Now over to Laurie.
Thank you, Danielle. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming to our webinar. It's been the first one we've had in a long time. I think it's been the first in 2 years. As Danielle said, my name is Laurie. I'm the co-founder and chief data officer at NPM Inc. Obviously, we're going to have a Q&A at the end, but if there's anything that you want to get in touch with me directly about, those are my contact details. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, we're going to be talking about JavaScript, which is obviously a huge surprise, but specifically, we're going to be talking about JavaScript being the most important language in your stack. I'm going to talk about why we think that using data that I've collected as part of my job, and I'm also going to get to what that means for you. So let's get straight into it. But before we do, a quick word on our sources for this data. I use a bunch of different places to get data, and I will usually mention where that is. But our two biggest ones are NPM's registry data, where we count downloads and we measure trends, and NPM's annual survey of NPM users, which got over 33,000 respondents last year. So if you don't hear me quote where the data is coming from, it's usually one of those two. But what I'm saying here is that we're not just guessing about these trends. We are working with real data. So the first thing to understand is that all signs point to JavaScript being the single most popular programming language in the world by every measure that we can think of. Here's a graph from the Module Counts website of the total numbers of modules in major package managers. The NPM registry is twice as big as the next biggest repository, which is Maven. Obviously, that's a little bit unfair because JavaScript tends towards lots of small modules and the other package managers don't. So how about if we look at projects created on GitHub? Here again, JavaScript is by far the biggest, and GitHub also ranks JavaScript the highest in terms of activity, PRs, issues, and all of its other measures. But that just means there's a lot of activity. What about the actual number of people involved? Stack Overflow recently released the results of its own annual developer survey. They surveyed over 80,000 developers worldwide. And from that amazing trove of data comes this graph of the most used programming languages. JavaScript was first for the 7th year in a row at 68% of developers. And of course, there's our own stats, which say that NPM has about 11 million users. The NPM registry serves over 2 billion downloads per day, and it has grown 25,000% since NPM Inc. started in 2014. In fact, 97% of the code in a modern web application is downloaded from NPM. You or the developers at your company are writing just the last 3% of your application, and the other 97% comes from us. It's the most important 3%, of course, but that is still an enormous amount of open source JavaScript that people are using. And of course, NPM is being used by far more than just web applications. In our survey results, 97% of people who use NPM said that they were using it to build web applications, but 77% also said that they are writing code for servers, and there were two big surprises here. 46% said that they are writing native apps, and 13% said that they are doing embedded apps. So let's look a little bit more at all of those numbers. The survey says that 97% of NPM users write for browsers, but browsers where? 99% of people write for desktop websites, 74% of people write for mobile websites, but only 2% of people write for mobile but not desktop, which explains why responsive web apps are such a common part of the developer experience these days. The survey also said that 77% of people are writing server apps, but where? Where are they deploying things? Unsurprisingly, containers like Docker and Kubernetes are everybody's jam these days. Deployment platforms like Heroku and Netlify are also a big target for people. VMs, virtual machines, are surprisingly unpopular, given that just 5 years ago they used to be the default way to deploy code. And the other surprise here was serverless. At 33%, Lambda and other cloud function platforms, they're not just for early adopters anymore. They are firmly in the mainstream ways of deploying your JavaScript code. The popularity of native apps, as I said, was a big surprise to us. 46% of NPM users, when there are 11 million NPM users, is so many people to be writing native applications in JavaScript when that's really not the purpose that JavaScript had in mind when it was invented. By native apps, we mean apps that run directly on your desktop or directly on your phone. This graph on the screen is the split within that 46%. So if you take that 46% and this split, you can work out the overall usage, and that means that 35% of NPM users are writing native mobile apps, and 26% are writing native desktop apps in JavaScript. These are big, big numbers. If you write native apps, you are no longer an edge case in the JavaScript world. You are a first-class citizen, and NPM wants to know how to take care of you. So looking at all this usage, it's worth asking, how did all of this happen? How did JavaScript go from being a toy language that people use to do form validation to the world's most popular programming language for all sorts of applications? The answer, at least partly, is the NPM registry. A guy called Leo Myrovich did a study a few years ago in which he researched why people pick a programming language. Was it the features of that language, the speed? Was it that their company forced them to? But the number one reason was the availability of open source libraries that help them get their job done. If there is a library that does what you want, you pick the language of that library to get your job done faster. And once you start using open source libraries, a positive feedback loop kicks in. Developers find open source JavaScript libraries that help them get their jobs done faster. They find them on the NPM registry, they install them, and then they write the remaining 3% of their application. They ship quickly, and they like that. Once in a while, like 1% of the time, something they write turns out to be so useful that they want to be able to use it again. So they publish it to the NPM registry. This means there's even more open source on the registry, which attracts even more people, until you've got 11 million developers. So say you buy all of these stats. You buy that JavaScript is super popular and growing super fast. That still hasn't answered the question, which is, why should you care? Why is it important to you in your stack today? The answer is because you are also using exponentially more JavaScript. Maybe 10 or even 5 years ago, you only had a handful of people at your company who wrote HTML and CSS and maybe some JavaScript. But now it is not uncommon for a large company to have hundreds of developers who do nothing but write JavaScript all day. We went and manually checked, and we verified that all 100 of the Fortune 100 are using NPM. We didn't get all the way through the Fortune 500, but we haven't yet found one who doesn't. So how much JavaScript are you using? We did a survey of several major financial firms, and on average, these big banks are actively using about 20,000 unique NPM packages each. They download each of those packages millions of times every month, and banks are not known as wild early adopters. So if that's how much banks use NPM, you're probably using even more. And one thing I want to emphasize is that using all of this JavaScript is a net good for you. Open source code has lots of users and will frequently be higher quality than anything that you wrote yourself. Using existing code helps you ship faster, and the reason all these people use all of this JavaScript is because it's generally speaking a good idea, but it is not without costs. Another thing we found when we looked at 8 of the largest banks was that they download a lot of stuff and it wasn't always safe. The 8 banks downloaded over 22,000 unique packages, which is, they did it more than 20 million times in a month. They downloaded 824 packages with vulnerabilities, and 7% of those vulnerabilities were critical. That's not good news. How did this happen? JavaScript snuck into big companies. One day it was a little form validation, and the next thing you know, you're spending $100 million a year on JavaScript devs, but you're not yet treating it like a language you spend that much money on. It takes big companies a while to catch up to rapid change like we've seen in the world of JavaScript. So by now, I'm hoping I've thrown enough numbers and graphs at you that you believe my thesis, which is that JavaScript is important to you. But if you believe that, what does that mean that you should do? It means that it's time to treat JavaScript the same way you treat other vital languages in your stack. It means spending some money to improve the efficiency of using JavaScript and the security of the JavaScript packages that you use. Unsurprisingly, NPM Inc. has some ideas about how you should do that. The 4 key points of professional JavaScript are security, compliance, collaboration, and control. And I'm going to talk about each one and what it means to do it professionally. That's going to involve mentioning NPM Enterprise, which is our SaaS service for companies who use JavaScript. But first, let's talk about security. JavaScript is a different beast from the languages that came before it. Other languages have just a handful of dependencies, and security processes were built for them. So you might have whitelists or blacklists of code you can and can't use. You might be reasonably expected to fill in a form to ask to use a new library in your project. You might even believe that your team would find the time to review the code of an open source package before they use it, though even with old languages, that was frankly a stretch. None of that is going to work for JavaScript, and I'm not just guessing here because we have the stats, and also you told us directly, you use 20,000 unique packages. You can't inspect them all, and you can't even pretend that you do. Just filling in the forms would take a month, and you ship hundreds of times a month, so there can't be a manual anything. You can't just ignore the processes and hope nobody notices. You have to throw out the broken processes and adopt best practices for JavaScript. To keep up with the pace of continuous deployment, you also have to adopt continuous security. NPM automatically runs a security scan every time you do an install, and you may have seen those notices when you did that. With NPM Enterprise, you can get those for all of your devs. Instead of a big security fire at the end of a sprint, you can notice and fix things as you go. NPM Enterprise has the best feed of JavaScript vulnerabilities in the industry. Features like blacklists assume that your team will hear about a vulnerability and want to block it specifically. But in reality, there's no chance that you'll hear about a vulnerability before we do. We have 11 million users, and we have a report vulnerability button on every single page. We hear about things sooner than anyone else, and NPM Enterprise has a live feed of those. And if you build with NPM Enterprise, you can run audits on builds and configure your builds to fail if they find vulnerabilities of a specified severity. So you can treat security scans as part of your test suite, happening on each and every build, silently, quickly, and transparently. The story with compliance in JavaScript is another story of abandoning the old ways. Again, you have 20,000 packages, so you just don't have the internal resources to be doing this stuff yourself. You'd have to create lists of viable licenses, you'd have to pay lawyers to interpret them, and the situation with software licenses is often foggy. Is it the license in package JSON? Is it the one in license.txt? What about stray bits of copy-pasted code that have other licenses? So NPM is going to do this for you too. We are currently working with major firms to define rules around what licenses are acceptable and accurately classifying existing packages so that you can have continuous compliance along with everything else. I talked earlier about the feedback loop that is propelling JavaScript to the stars. The reason I said it was relevant to us here is because the same feedback loop can be used to power productivity in your organization. A decade ago, your company probably employed only a handful of people who wrote JavaScript, and now it's likely that you employ hundreds of them if you're a big company, and they're probably writing quite similar things. They need to be able to find already written code, they need to be able to reuse it easily, and they need to be able to publish their own. With NPM Enterprise, you get a website just like npmjs.com. You can see new packages as they're published by far-flung colleagues all over the world, and you can create organizations and publish things either within your team or for the whole company to be able to see. Just like the NPM website, you also get full text search of all the public packages as well as any internal packages. Every package gets its own page with a full README, so you don't have to build your own documentation site. And package pages will also show you dependents and dependencies, so you can see who inside the company is using the software that you've written. And when your devs find code they want to use, they can just install it, just like any other NPM package. When you install a package, you don't need to have a meeting, you don't need to coordinate release cycles, you don't need to satisfy stakeholders, you just install the thing and get on with it. And the great thing is that once you've installed it, if the people inside your company who have written that package release a security patch, you'll get it automatically. And if they release a breaking change, you won't. This isn't some special new functionality, this is just how NPM and semantic versioning have always worked. This distributed, decoupled way of developing is second nature in the open source world, and it can work just as well inside your company, increasing the velocity and quality of your code. So all of what I've been saying so far sounds pretty great, but it also sounds kind of like letting go. I'm saying stop trying to maintain your own vulnerability database. Stop auditing your licenses one at a time. Take the brakes off of your internal collaboration. All of this can sound great to developers, but to managers and IT, it can sound kind of scary. The problem with most attempts by companies to control what their developers do is that things get adversarial. A new tool is introduced so that management can see what's going on, or a security check is put in place that everything has to run things through, and it slows stuff down, and developers hate it. But even worse than slowing your team down is that tools that claim to provide control, but that developers hate, will give you a false sense of security. Developers can and will work around proxies. They will sideload banned modules on home Wi-Fi. They will check in disallowed dependencies because they need to get stuff done. NPM Enterprise doesn't have that problem because NPM Enterprise works just like NPM, and developers using NPM all the time was the problem you were trying to solve in the first place. Developers love NPM, and NPM Enterprise is just more NPM because in addition to all of the public modules, it has all of the fun internal company modules. So what is it we've built into NPM Enterprise that gives you the control that you want? The first and most obvious is single sign-on. There is an enterprise software management tool that I shall not name that people actually pay money for, where all package publishes are done by logging into a single box and publishing as a single user, and I am frankly astonished that anyone puts up with that. Our single sign-on works as you would expect any single sign-on to work. It works with any OIDC provider, which is to say all of the ones that you'd expect, so you don't have to be constantly managing your users. You can even sign in straight from the command line. You just run npm login, and it will open a browser window where you can log in using your third-party auth or two-factor auth or both of the above. You can require a second factor to publish once you're authenticated in the browser. The CLI then gets a token behind the scenes, and it starts working without having to copy-paste credentials and keys around. You also get full visibility of what's going on in your company's local NPM community. All of the packages published, every user authorized, every invitation sent and accepted, all of the organizations and teams created. And of course, your NPM Enterprise instance runs on its own dedicated hardware inside of Google's cloud. If you need a different cloud, you can come and talk to us. It will run in the legal jurisdiction that you need with strong guarantees of network and data isolation. One thing we hear sometimes when we talk about NPM Enterprise is we already have a thing that does that. So I should mention the other solutions, but what it boils down to is this. Unless you've already bought our thing, you do not have a thing that does this. Java and JavaScript have similar names, but using a tool that was built for Java to manage your JavaScript is like using a hammer instead of a screwdriver because nails and screws are both kind of pointy. This is the real NPM. It looks like NPM, it works like NPM, and developers love it like they love NPM. So obviously it's a huge surprise that a company recommends its own product, but there's a reason it's good, and it's because we focus on JavaScript. Other tools will try to be all things to all languages and end up half-assing every language equally. We picked the most important language in your stack and doubled down on doing it properly because it really is a surprise that JavaScript has become the most important language you use, but now that that's true, you need to focus on it. So to recap, JavaScript is very popular. It's popular for web and server and mobile and desktop apps. You probably use more than 20,000 packages, and you need to secure them and you need to ensure compliance. You want to foster internal collaboration, but you don't want to lose control, and we built NPM Enterprise to satisfy those needs. And that concludes the webinar. Who's got questions? I see a couple of questions already in there. The first question is a good one is, are laptops considered mobile or desktop in the numbers presented? Laptops are considered desktop computers. They are not a mobile device. They're not a small screen device. Another question is NPM a company? Yes, we are a company, and we've been a company since 2014. But getting that message out to the world is something we're still trying to do. And the next question is, will you be doing another survey soon? Will you be asking new questions based on last year's findings? Yes. Well, this is actually our second survey. We did a survey in December of 2017, and this survey was done in December of 2018. And we did a lot of refining of the questions that we asked based on the answers that we got to that. That was why we went deep on various questions like frameworks and things that we'll be covering in later webinars. But if you are interested in more data coming out of the survey, you should definitely tune into the next webinar because we will be covering more of that. All right. Does anybody else have any questions? Those were the first three that came out of the gate.
Great, thank you, Laurie. As mentioned earlier, today's webinar will be available on demand after the live session and is accessible through the same link you're using now. We've also added some related material, including today's slides, which are available in the attachments tab at the bottom of your screen. Don't miss our next webinar, Where JavaScript is Going in 2019, next week on Tuesday, April 30th at 10 a.m. Pacific Time, 12 p.m. Central Time, and 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you for joining.